Okay, here we are at chapter 23. In the weeks following his final encounters with the three bullies, Horace noticed a definite change in life at the battle school. The most important factor in the change was that Errol, Bryn, and Jeremy were all expelled from the school and from the castle and its neighbouring village. Sir Rodney had been suspicious for some time that there had been a problem among the ranks of his junior students. A quiet visit from Holt alerted him as to where it lay, and the resultant investigation soon brought to light the full story of the way Horace had been victimized. Sir Rodney's judgment was swift and uncompromising. The three second-year students were given a half-day to prepare and pack. They were supplied with a small amount of money and a week's supplies and were transported to the fief's boundaries, where they were told in no uncertain terms not to return. Once they were gone, Horace's lot improved considerably. The daily routine of the Vale School was still as harsh as ever and challenging as ever, but without the added burden that Errol, Bryn, and Jeremy had laid upon him. Horace found he could easily cope with the drills, the discipline, and the studies. He rapidly began to achieve the potential that Sir Rodney had seen in him. In addition, his roommates, without the fear of incurring the bullies' vengeance, began to be more welcoming and friendly. In short, Horace felt things were definitely looking up. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to thank Holt properly for the improvements in his life. After the events in the meadow, Horace had been placed in the infirmary for several days, while his bruises and continuous con- conscious conscience contusions were attended to. By the time he was released, he found that Holt and Will had already left for the Rangers' gathering. "Are we nearly there?" Will asked for perhaps the 10th time that morning. Holt gave a very small sigh of exasperation. Other than that, he made no reply. They had been on the road now for 3 days, and it seemed to Will that they must be close to the gathering grounds. Several times in the past hour, he had noticed an unfamiliar scent on the air. On the air. Oh, on the air. Passed on the air. He mentioned it to Holt, who said briefly, "It's salt. We're getting close to the sea," then refused to elaborate any further. Will glanced sidelong at the teacher, hoping that perhaps Holt might deign to share a little more information with him, but the ranger's keen eyes were scanning the ground in front of them. From time to time, oh my gosh, Will noticed he looked up into the trees that flanked the road. "Are you looking for something?" Will asked, and Holt turned in his saddle. "Finally, a useful question," he said. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. The chief ranger will have sentries out around the gathering ground. I always like to try to fool them as I'm approaching." "Why?" asked Will, and Holt allowed himself a tight little grin. "It keeps them on their toes," he explained. They'll try to slip behind us and follow us in, just so they can say they've ambushed me. It's a silly game they like to play." "Why is it silly?" asked Will. It sounded exactly like the sort of skill exercise that he and Holt practiced regularly. The grizzled ranger turned in his saddle and fixed Will with an unblinking stare. "Because they never succeed," he said, "and this year they'll be trying even harder because they know I'm bringing an apprentice. They'll want to see how good you are." "Is this part of the testing?" Will asked, and Holt nodded. "It's the start of it. Do you remember what I told you last night?" Will nodded. For the past 2 nights around the campfire, Holt's soft voice had given Will advice and instructions on how to conduct himself at the gathering. Last night, they've devised the tactics for use in case of an ambush, just the sort of thing that Holt had mentioned now. When will we? He began, but suddenly Holt was alert. He held up a warning finger for silence, and Will stopped speaking instantly. The ranger's hand was turned slightly. The two horses continued without hesitation. Hear it? Holt asked. Will craned his head too. He thought that just maybe he could hear the soft hoofbeats behind them, but he wasn't sure. The gait of their own horses masked any real sound from the trail behind. If there was someone there, his horse was moving in step with their own. Change gait, Holt whispered. On three. 1, 2, 3. Simultaneously, they both nudged their left toes into the horse's shoulders. It was just one of many signals to which Tug and Albert were trained to respond. Instantly, both horses hesitated in their strides. They seemed to skip a pace. They continued in their even gait, but the hesitation had changed the pattern of their hoofbeats, and for an instant, Will could hear another set of horses' hooves behind them, like a slightly delayed echo. Then the other horses changed gait as well to match their own, and the sound was gone. Ranger's horse, Holt said softly. It'll be Gillian for sure. Gillian for sure. How can you tell? Will asked. Only a ranger horse could change his pace as quickly as that, and it'll be Gillian because it's always Gillian. He loves trying to catch me out. Why? Asked Will, and Holt looked sternly at him. Because he was my last apprentice, he explained, and for some reason, former apprentices just love to catch their former masters with their breeches down. He looked accusingly at his current apprentice, but was about to protest that he would never behave in such a fashion after he graduated, then realized that he probably would, and at the very first opportunity. The protest died unspoken. Holt signaled for silence and scanned the trail ahead of them. Then he pointed. That's the spot there, he said. Ready? There was a large tree close to the side of the trail, with branches hanging out just about head height. Will studied it for a moment, then nodded. Tug and Albert continued their even pacing towards the tree. As they came closer, Will kicked his feet from the stirrup and rose to stand, crouching on Tug's back. The horse didn't vary his pace as his master shifted position. As they passed under the branches, Will reached up and seized the lower one, swinging himself up onto it. The instant his weight left Tug's back, the little horse began to pace more vigorously, forcing his hooves into the ground with each step, so that there would be no sign to a tracker behind them that his load had suddenly lightened. Silently, Will climbed higher into the trees until he found a spot where he had a solid perch and a clear view. He could see Holt and the two horses moving slowly down this trail. As they reached the next bend, Holt urged Tug to keep going, then halted Albert and swung down from the saddle. He dropped to his knees, seeming to study the ground for signs of tracks. Now Will could hear the other horse behind them. He looked back the way they had come, but another bend hid their follower from sight. Then the soft hoof beats ceased. Will's mouth was dry, and his heart beat faster and faster inside his rib cage. He was sure the sound must be audible to anyone within 50 meters or so, but his training asserted itself, and he stood motionless on the tree branch, among the leaves and dappled shadows, watching the trail behind them. A movement. He saw it from the corner of his eyes, then it was gone. He peered closely at the spot for a second or two, then remembered Holt's lessons. Don't focus your attention on one spot. Keep a wide focus all the time and keep scanning. You'll see him as a moment, as a movement, not as a figure. Remember, he's a ranger too, and he's been trained in the art of not being seen. Will widened his focus and scanned the forest behind them. Within seconds, he was rewarded by another sign of movement. A branch swung back into place as an unseen figure passed silently by. Then 10 meters further on, a bush swayed slightly. Then he saw a clump of tall grass springing slowly back into position from where a passing foot had crushed it momentarily. Will stayed stock still. He marveled at the fact that their pursuer could move through the forest without his seeing him. Obviously, the other ranger had left his horse behind and was stalking Holt on foot. Will's eyes swiveled for a quick glance at Holt. His teacher still seemed to be preoccupied with some sign on the ground. About another movement came from the forest. The unseen ranger had passed Will's hiding place now and was moving back towards the trail, intent on surprising Holt from behind. Suddenly, a tall figure in a straggling green cloak seemed to rise out of the ground in the middle of the trail, some 20 meters behind the kneeling figure of Holt. Will blinked. One moment the figure hadn't been there, next he seemed to materialize out of thin air. Will's hand began to move towards the quivers of arrows slung over his back. Then he halted the movement. Holt had told him the night before, wait until we're talking. If he's not talking, he'll hear the slight movement you make. Will gulped, hoping that the tall figure hadn't heard the movement of his hand towards the quiver, but it seemed that he'd stopped in time. Below him he heard a cheerful voice call out, "Halt! Halt!" Holt turned and rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees as he rose. He put his head on one side and studied the figure in the middle of the trail, who was leaning easily on a longbow, identical to Holt's own. "Well, Gillian," he called, "I see you're still making that old joke." The tall ranger shrugged and replied cheerfully, "The joke appears to be on you this year, Holt." As Gillian spoke, Will's hand moved quickly but quietly to his quiver and selected an arrow, laying it ready on the bowstring. Holt was speaking again now. "Really, Gillian? And what joke would that be, I wonder?" The amusement was evident in Gillian's voice as he replied to his old master, "Come now, Holt, admit it. For once I've got the best of you, and you know how many years I've been trying." Holt rubbed one hand over his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "It beats me. I beat me why you keep on trying, Gillian, as a matter of fact." Gillian laughed. "You should know how much pleasure it gives an ex-apprentice to get the better of his master. Holt, now come on, admit it. This year I've won." As the tall figure spoke, Will carefully drew back the arrow, sighting on a tree trunk some 2 meters to Gillian's left. Holt's instructions echoed in his head. Choose a target close enough to startle him, when you shoot, but for pity's sake, not too close. If he moves, I don't want you putting an arrow through him." Holt hadn't moved from his position in the center of the trail. Gillian was now shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to another. Holt's unperturbed manner was beginning to bother him. It appeared that all All of a sudden, he wasn't totally sure that Holt was merely trying to bluff his way out of the trap. Holt's next words added to his suspicion. Ah, yes, apprentices and masters. They're a strange combination, all right. But tell me, Gillian, my old apprentice, aren't you forgetting something this year? Perhaps it was the way Holt laid a little extra stress on the word apprentice, but suddenly Gillian became aware that he had made a mistake. His head began to turn, searching for the apprentice that he had forgotten. As he began the movement, Will released his arrow. The shaft hissed through the air past the tall ranger and thudded quivering into the trees that Will had selected. Gillian jerked back with shock. Then his eyes swung into the branches of the tree where Will stood concealed. Will marveled that even caught by surprise as he was, Gillian was still able to react so quickly and indefinitely in identifying the direction from which his attacker had shot. Gillian shook his head ruefully. His keen eyes could make out the small grey and green cloak figure concealed in the shadows of the trees, foliage. Come down, Will, Holt called, and meet Gillian, one of our more careless rangers. He shook his head at Gillian. I told you when you were a boy, didn't I? Never be too hasty. Don't rush into things. Gillian nodded, somewhat crestfallen. He looked even more so when Will dropped to the ground from the lowest branch, and the tall ranger saw how small and young the apprentice was. It appears, he said, that I was so intent on catching myself an old grey fox that I overlooked the small monkey hiding in the trees. He grinned at his own mistake. Monkeys, is it? Holt said gruffly. I'd say he'd made a monkey out of you today. Well, this is Gillian, my former apprentice and now ranger of Merrick Fief, although what they did to deserve him is beyond me. Gillian's grin widened, and he held out his hand to Will. And just as I was thinking I'd finally got to the better of you, Holt, he said cheerfully. So you're Will, he continued, shaking hands firmly. I'm pleased to meet you. That was a neat piece. That was a neat piece of work, young fellow. Will grinned at Holt, and the older ranger made a slight, meaningful movement of his head. Will remembered the final instruction that Holt had given him the night before. Once you best a man, never gloat. Get generous and find something in his actions to praise. He won't enjoy being bested, but he'll make a good face of it. Show him you appreciate it. Praise can win you a friend. Gloating will only ever make enemies. Yes, I'm Will, he said. Then he added, could you perhaps teach me how you move like that? It was brilliant. Gillian laughed ruefully. Not too brilliant, I think. You obviously saw me coming from a long way away. Will shook his head, remembering how hard he tried to spot Gillian. Now that the thought of it, his praise and his request were more genuine than he'd realized. I saw you when you arrived, he said, and I saw where you'd been, but I never once saw you from the time you rounded that bend. I wish I could move like that. Gillian's face showed his pleasure at Will's obvious sincerity. Well, Holt, he said, I see young fellows doesn't merely have talent. He has excellent manners as well. Holt regarded the two of them, his current apprentice and his former student. He nodded to Will approvingly, tactful words. His tactful words. Use unseen movement was always Gillian's best skill, he said. You do well if he agreed to tutor you. He moved towards his ex-apprentice and placed his arms around the taller man's shoulders. It's good to see you again. They embraced each other warmly. Then Holt held the other man at arm's length, studying him carefully. You get lankier every year, he said finally. When are you going to put some meat on those bones? Gillian smiled. It was obviously an old joke between them. You appear to have enough for both of us, he said. He poked Holt in the ribs, none too gently. Is that the beginnings of a pot-belly I see there? He grinned at Will. I'll wager he's sitting around the cabin letting you do all the housework these days. Before Holt or Will could reply, he turned away and let out a whistle. A few seconds later, his horse trotted round the bend in the road. As the tall young ranger moved towards his horse and mounted, Will noticed a sword hanging in a scabbard from the saddle. He turned to Holt, puzzled. I thought we weren't allowed to have swords, he said quietly. Holt frowned for a moment, not understanding then following Will's gaze and realized what had prompted the question. It's not that we're not allowed, he explained as they both mounted. It's a matter of priorities. It takes years to become a good swordsman, and we don't have the time. We have other skills to develop. He saw the next question forming on Will's lips and went on. Gillian's father is a knight, so Gillian had already been training with the sword for some years before he joined the Rangers. He was considered a special case, and he was allowed to continue that training when he was apprenticed to me. But I thought Will began and then hesitated. Gillian was trotting his horse towards them, and he wasn't sure if it would be polite to ask his next question in front of him. Never say that in front of Holt, Gillian said, overhearing Will's last words. He'll simply reply, You're an apprentice, you're not ready to think. Or if you thought about it, you wouldn't ask. Will had to smile. Holt had used those exact words to him on more than one occasion, and Gillian's impressions of the older ranger was uncanny. Now, however, both men were looking expectantly at him, waiting to hear the question he had been about to ask, so he plunged a chart in ahead. If Gillian's father was a knight, wasn't he automatically eligible for battle school, or did they think he was too small as well? Holt and Gillian exchanged a look. Holt raised one eyebrow, then gestured for Gillian to reply. I could have gone to battle school, he said, but I chose to join the Rangers. Some of us do, you know. Holt put it mildly. Will thought this over. He had always assumed that the Rangers did not come from the ranks of the Kingdom's nobles. Apparently he was wrong. But I thought he began and instantly realized his mistake. Holt and Gillian looked at him, then looked at each other and said in chorus, You're an apprentice, you're not ready to think. Then they wheeled their horses and trotted off. Will hurriedly retrieved Tug and cantered after them. As he caught up, the two rangers edged their horses to either side, allowing him space to ride between them. Gillian grinned once at him. Holt was as grim as ever, but as they continued in a companionable silence, Will became aware of the comforting realization that he was now a part of an exclusively tight-knit group. It was a warm sense of belonging, as if somehow he had arrived home for the first time in his life. Okay, well, thank you for reading up to chapter 23 with me. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 24, then please come back and stay tuned for the next episode or the next parts on the playlist on my channel. Thank you. Bye.